This is Johnny Dosco. Stay tuned for another Score Sheet podcast. Holy Kadelka!
Hi, and welcome to another Score Sheet podcast. Today we have as our guest Joe Sheehan, a gentleman I've known for many years. Joe started writing about baseball 20-some years ago. He was a co-founder of Baseball Prospectus, writes for Sports Illustrated, MLB.com, is on the Major League Baseball Network, etc., etc. Hi, Joe. How are you?
Good, Jeff. What's going on?
Well, another beautiful day getting ready for some baseball.
What are we, 9 days away from pitchers and catchers because you got the Mariners and A's reporting early because they're going to Japan to play, so it's getting pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's, and there's signings going on every day. The transactions are full of guys signing mostly minor league deals, but, once in a while you get an Edwin Jackson finally signing.
You got to pay attention to that smaller stuff, too. If you play in deeper leagues, and guys like us, we're hardcore. We play in these, leagues that have deep keepers, and you go 12 deep in an NL, and some of these minor signings can actually make a difference in terms of job fights. And there's always somebody that comes out of nowhere, so you definitely want to pay attention to the non-Edwin Jackson signings.
Yeah, I saw this morning that Casey Kotchman signed a minor league deal with Cleveland.
Yeah, and he ends up, because you look at that team, and Matt Laporte has never really developed. So they were playing Carlos Santana at first base a little bit this year. Okay, does this mean that Kotchman plays first? Santana catches more? Does that affect Lou Marson's playing time? And unfortunately, you and I, probably play in some leagues where Lou Marson's playing time is actually going to be relevant.
Yeah, that's one of the differences about playing in the deeper leagues, which most of Score Sheet leagues are fairly deep. So, any league, of course, the Albert Pujolses have kind of the same value. But in Score Sheet, yeah, the guys that are middle relievers and maybe, like you said, a backup catcher actually have some relevance.
That comes into greater play in a game like Score Sheet, where it's not just the offensive stats as well. You've got to worry about the defensive skill, or something like you mentioned middle relievers. And, I can remember playing Murphy, which is one of the older leagues in Score Sheet dating back to forever, and a lot of people know have probably played in this league, but the depth meant that you had to care about the third right-handed reliever in the Astros bullpen. And I say it's not for everybody to go that deep, and 12-team mixed leagues are all the rage in any format. But I got to tell you, there's something about needing to understand the effect of a Casey Kotchman signing that it really brings out the obsessive in me.
Yeah, I think it's just kind of appeals maybe to a different person. And middle relievers especially, I think, are one difference in Score Sheet because they really don't have much relevance in straight rotisserie, but they surely have a lot of relevance in real baseball.
They're starting to see even a greater respect for them. So, occasionally you'll see a middle reliever make the All-Star team now, but even in getting paid, it's not happening. Somebody like, I guess David Robertson is a good example. The difference between getting saves and not getting saves is maybe $3 million in arbitration, and that money, going forward. David Robertson was one of the best pitchers in baseball last year, but because he didn't get the saves and he wasn't a starting pitcher, he doesn't make a whole lot of money. In a format like Score Sheet, he's going to be one of your more valuable guys because of the skill set, the strikeouts, the inability. He doesn't give up homers, all the things that he does really well. So again, different. Everyone plays different games, but a game that kind of more accurately reflects the importance of a player's performance, independent of these team contexts, is, I think, a better game.
Yeah. Well, I know you've been saying for many years now that you think this whole concept of closers and saves is a little ridiculous. That I think you're a fan of put your best pitcher in the highest leverage situation, and if that's in the seventh inning with the bases loaded and the cleanup hitter coming up, then that's when your best pitcher should be in the game.
Yeah, I'm willing to concede a certain amount of reality to it. I don't think you could go back to, Jeff, when I was doing this research into Jack Morris's career, I read literally every Tigers box score for a 12-year period. And you go back to the late 1970s, and the starter would get bombed, and here comes Aurelio Lopez in to pitch 6 straight innings. And I'm not saying you have to go back to that. But there's too many times now where, as you say, the key point in the game is with 2 outs in the 7th, protecting a 1-run lead with 2nd and 3rd, and that ends up getting, for teams that don't have deep bullpens, that ends up getting pitched by a guy who has no business pitching in that situation. And the, quote, closer, who is the best reliever in the bullpen, never gets off his butt because they give up 2 runs there and they end up losing the game. And so I think the 7th and certainly the 8th inning are spots where we should be using the best relievers independent of the save rule. The save rule has really changed how managers run their bullpens, and not in a good way. And I think the single biggest difference, and folks, if you're watching a game in the middle of April, just keep an eye out for this sequence happening. You have a team that has a big difference between its closer and its second best reliever. The opposing team has its 3, 4, and 5 hitters up, and the second best reliever comes in and pitches, gets out of it, and then the closer comes in to pitch to the bottom of the lineup in the ninth. There's absolutely no reason in the world for that to happen. And this is why setup men end up being so important, because if you think about sequencing, Jeff, the average number of batters in a game is 37. So 37 hitters come up in a game. The eighth inning is basically the middle of the lineup for the fourth time, and then the ninth is the bottom of the lineup, and then maybe that leadoff hitter in the ninth. And generally speaking, your setup men are facing tougher batters in the eighth than the closer is in the ninth. So that to me is the best argument against closing, because you've got inferior pitchers facing the best hitters.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that the use of bullpens has definitely been hurt by the save rule. However, you alluded to salaries before, and so I don't think you're going to convince Brian Wilson to give up the chance to get 45 saves now. You know, if the manager, Bochy, tries to put him in the eighth inning and says you're not going to get a save, but you're going to win the game for the Giants, in a perfect world, Brian Wilson would be ecstatic with that. But in the real world, I think he says, well, I want a save.
Well, a few things would have to change. One, this would have to occur over time. But remember, we've bred this into the species. It's only in the last 30 years that we've started worrying about save counts in terms of evaluating relievers. So I think we'd have to breed it out of the species in the same way that we bred it in. It's not like, this wasn't the way baseball was played for a million years. It's a fairly recent occurrence. And I think it would have to occur over a generation. But I don't think you mess with it. I think you've got Mariano Rivera. We're just going to let Mariano Rivera play it out. Joaquin Soria, maybe, Jonathan Papelbon. But for 22 major league teams, you go in and say, we're going to do it this way because it's the better way to win baseball games. And eventually pitchers will get used to this is how we do it because, in 1977, this is how they did it. And, things weren't all that much different. One of the key things to notice here is that even though individual reliever stats have improved, strikeout rates and things like that, teams don't do a better job of protecting ninth inning leads than they did a half century ago. The winning percentage when a team leads in the ninth inning is pretty much exactly the same as it was before any of this started. So it's not like it's created any additional efficiencies, but it has served to funnel a lot of money into this, quote, closer role that is supposed to be so special. Here's the other thing, Jeff. Talking about Brian Wilson. Leave the money out of it for a second. The idea is that closers are supposed to be really mentally tough. How is it that you can have this whatever mental toughness that is necessary to pitch the ninth inning and get the last 3 outs, but not be mentally tough enough to be called into work 45 minutes earlier? I don't get that contrast.
No, I think the whole thing's a little gotten too far out of whack. But, that's one thing some people do like about Score Sheet is, I remember back in the day when the Cincinnati Reds had that nasty bullpen, Rob Dibble never got a save, or very few saves for the Reds. But in Score Sheet, a lot of people one year said he was the most valuable pitcher in Score Sheet because we allow you to use relievers kind of as closers, whether they have saves or not. So I think people like that when they manage a simulated game or manage a Score Sheet team, they can actually decide, well, I think this guy's just as good a pitcher as that. I'll make him my closer, and I'll let this guy pitch in the 7th or 8th inning.
Yeah, and I actually like that about Score Sheet as opposed to, and if I can mention it here, Strat. I've played Strat before I even played Score Sheet. And around about the late 1980s, Strat kind of modified their reliever rules to kind of force you to use guys who'd closed in the regular season. It was an optional rule, but they wanted basically to funnel the saves to the guys who'd actually gotten saves. And it kind of changed the structure of Strat. And one of the things, comparing it to Score Sheet, I think Score Sheet's method is a lot better, where they say, hey, look, it's about skills and how good you are, not how you were used by your major league team. And again, you talk about raw simulations. I enjoy Roto. I really do enjoy category-based Roto, but for just straight realism and filling out a season, I like the flexibility you get with Score Sheet. And even, one of the things that's changed over the last couple of years is the software where you kind of see your game play out. I can remember getting the printed sheets years ago, or getting the text files, and trying to hide the box score so that I couldn't see exactly what had happened and watch the game. And now you can actually see the game play out in real time. That's just something you don't get from Roto.
Yeah, I remember those days. I remember people used to call me and say, well, I've come up with this cardboard cutout with hole here, here, and here, and I can slide it over and hide the pitcher box score so I don't, find out what happened at all. So yeah, I think the fact you can play out the game at bat by bat on the web and watch it is definitely an improvement over the old cardboard cutout days.
A little bit, yeah. So yeah, And like I say, you talk about the things that the score sheet brings, and I'd say I don't want to turn this to an ad for score sheet, but it's something I've enjoyed. And in fact, I was just talking to a friend of mine the other day, and we're gonna try to work it out so we can get into a league together and kind of compete with each other. And the format of it is just a lot more. Like I say, nothing against 5x5. I play in 5x5 leagues, and I enjoy that too. But there's something about essentially, as somebody who came from a strat background, to play a game that kind of simulates that experience of actually playing the baseball game is really exciting in a way that maybe if people didn't already have that strat or sim league background, they wouldn't appreciate so much.
Yeah, it's different. Well, moving on from Scorsese, let's talk a little bit about what you're doing. You started a newsletter about 3 years ago, a paid subscription model where you get, I think it's 180 newsletters a year for $29. So it's something like a whopping 15 cents a newsletter.
Yeah, I started this back in May I had initially done a short run almost a decade ago. After I took a hiatus from Prospectus, was doing this, and then Prospectus decided to go to a pay model, in part because the success I'd had with that initial run of the newsletter back in 2002. And then in 2010, I'd left Prospectus. I'm like, well, let me try this again. And, it's been pretty successful. I kind of try to be transparent about the numbers. I can tell you that I had a little over 1,000 subscribers for last year. Renewal rate of 70% over the previous year. I'm out there getting new people. It was $29.95 for most of the year. I cut it down at the end. One of the restrictions I have is that I don't know going into each year if I'm going to keep doing it. So instead of having rolling subscriptions, it's $29.95 for a fixed period, and then I can go into the off season. Because just in case the Astros call and want to make me their GM, I want the flexibility to be able to not do the newsletter. I love writing about baseball, and I think that's the one thing that comes through it. If people are familiar with my work through Prospectus, they think, a bunch of stats, and certainly there's going to be a lot of stats in there because I think that's a great prism for looking at the game. But really what I try to present there is the fact that, guys like me, stat heads, love baseball. I think the passion for the game really comes through. I probably don't do as much fantasy content as some people would like. That's probably the most common complaint other than the copy editing. Copy editing can be pretty sloppy. It's something I'm working on, folks. But the fantasy stuff, I haven't written as much about fantasy, and maybe try to get back into that a little more this coming year. But trade analysis, game analysis, issues of the game. It's not just studies, stat breakdowns. And I'll tell a lot of people, I'm not really one of the hardcore stat heads. There's people out there like Mike Fast and Tom Tango, Colin Wires, who do this stuff so much better than I do. My skill is that I can write a little bit.
It's maybe a little bit to me like those Bill James analysts that we all read 20, 30 years ago. It's really good writing, and then you use the numbers to make your point. But it's not just a bunch of tables and numbers. It's a baseball article that uses statistics to back up your arguments.
Yeah, and that's what I'm going for. And one of the things, you mentioned 180. That's kind of the number I hung out last year, and ended up doing 172 newsletters, and then a whole bunch of other things. And we're trying to move to a model this year. I don't want to use the word blog model. That's not really what I'm looking for, but I want to try to find ways to get information, get content into the hands of the subscribers that doesn't necessarily have to be the 1,500-word column or, in all too often, the 3,000-word column that I end up writing kind of to expand on an issue, where I can just do quick hitters and say, here's 500 words on this game I just watched, or here's 300 words on a fantasy transaction I just made, or a quick hitter on a call-up, just things like that, where it's try to get out of a fixed model and try to use the flexibility of self-publishing to get information into the hands of people. It's one of the things I'm working on for 2012. One of the things I did in 2011, Jeff, and I know you saw this, was to write about the games that I'd be focusing on that night. So at 6:30 Eastern, send out an email and say, okay, I'm watching everything, but these are the 4 or 5 games that I really want to focus on for one reason or another. So just little things like that where you're trying to say, how can I add value to the subscription, get information in the hands of people, and make sure that they're enjoying it. So I don't think this is ever going to be a 150,000 mailing list thing. I mean, if I'm writing for 150,000 people, that's what I do for SI.com. If I want to write for 3 million people, that goes in Sports Illustrated magazine. But the ability to write for a selected audience of 1,000, 1,500 people, that's kind of a really cool thing. You can do some different things there with a small audience.
Yeah, well, I really enjoy the newsletter, from the little blurbs, like you said, reminding me that I should watch the Dodger game that night because Kershaw is pitching, to your, like you said, 2,000-3,000 word analysis pieces. But it's also, between Prospectus and the things you've done, I mean, now you're doing a fair amount of work for MLB itself.
MLB Network, I've been very lucky to be involved with them over the last year and change. I started working on the Fantasy 4-in-1 show on every afternoon. I did some pinch hitting for, and you know Corey Schwartz and Mike Ciano, great guys. Yeah, they've been in the industry forever. They got this show on the network. I did some work for them in 2010. And then they brought me in 2011 along with Nando DeFino as kind of rotating substitute hosts. And then late in 2011, when Brian Kenny, who I'd known up at when he was with ESPN, moved to MLB Network, he was starting a show called Clubhouse Confidential. Brian is one of the most prominent stat heads in what you call mainstream media, and he very much wanted to bring that voice to the network. So he started the show, and it's been a huge hit. He's had me on. He's had Jay Jaffe of Prospectus on. He's had Vince Gennaro on. He's had all of these prominent stat heads to come on and present baseball information, not from the usual prism of players and managers and insiders, but from analysts. And he's really kind of raised that up to, this is a legitimate way of looking at baseball, and this is how I want to present it. So the show's been a very big hit. It's given voice to the stat head community. And then we've also been doing these top 10 shows, and Brian's invited me to be a part of those as well. There's an interaction and a way of presenting where you say, okay, these are the numbers, and then you get the player analysis where you say, well, this is how those numbers are being built. Or the player will make an observation, and I'll come in with, well, yeah, and here's what the stats show. It really backs that up. There's a lot more support than there is conflict, and I think that's really been one of the great things about the top 10 shows that's come through.
Yeah, I think it's better than the Moneyball portrait, which is stats versus scouts, like you said. It's definitely seems like that everybody's realized they both have value. There's something to be said for scouts, certainly. There's something to be said for stats, and if you get both sides of the coin, then you learn more.
Well, I think that's something to be said too for the players accepting of that too. I've gotten to work with Al Leiter, Eric Burns, Dan Plesac, all the analysts they have at the network so far, and the players had to have some buy-in too, and they've been fantastic. There's not this sense of, what is this stuff? You didn't play the game. You're not getting any of that. Maybe that would have been the case a decade ago. I don't know. All I know is that the people that I've worked with at the network have been uniformly great, curious, and open, and open to me saying, hey, what about this? Me asking questions and getting things explained to me. I cannot say enough about how I feel these shows have succeeded because of Brian, because of the player analysts sitting there and going, listening to this information and not rejecting it out of hand. There's not a lot of conflict. There's a lot of good stuff being presented. And certainly, I gotta tell you, Jeff, the feedback on the top 10 shows have been very great so far, and people are enjoying the information. So much of my, for lack of a better word, career has been dumb luck, whether it's getting to know Gary Huckabee 20 years ago on Rec Sport Baseball and being involved when he was starting Prospectus, or getting to be the guy that ended up going on TV for the first time when the ESPN News was looking for somebody to promote one of our annuals. Peter Gammons mentioning the newsletter when I was doing that. Getting into Tout Wars at a time when Sam Walker was writing the book and getting some publicity for that. And something like this where Brian Kenny moves to MLB Network at a point where there's an opportunity for stat heads to make an impression. There's a lot of luck involved, and I'm very, very fortunate.
Well, and you're getting to do what you love. Well, Joe, it's been really good talking to you. I'm glad to catch up with you. I saw you at the Arizona Fall League a couple months ago, so it's nice to be able to chat with you again.
Thanks, Jeff.